Richard is one of the foremost proponents of what might be called the mythicist view of Jesus, the view that Jesus actually did not exist historically, and we'll be hearing his case for that in today's show. Mark Goodare doesn't take that view. He doesn't believe that's the best explanation of the evidence we have before us. He says Jesus did exist. We can quibble about the what actually happened in those stories and all the rest of it, but the fact that there was a Jesus of Nazareth isn't really in dispute. So we're going to hear from Mark as to why he holds to that view and hear the interaction today. So first of all, welcome along, Richard. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Well, you've just literally stepped off a plane.
Literally, yes.
Into the studio. So we've got you at your your most depleted and
all the way from California. California, it's the worst, right?
It is. That's an 8-hour time difference, isn't it? So this should be easy for Mark today. But seriously, you've been kind of at the forefront of this particular view on the historicity of Jesus for some time. What got you into this whole area, though, to start with? Maybe we should start there.
I actually started where Dr. Goodare is. I thought it was a ridiculous notion. That certainly the consensus, the overwhelming consensus, is that Jesus existed. And usually, as a historian, you would just presume historicity. That's usually the default position, and you would need a really good case to argue otherwise. And then several people kept insisting that I needed to read Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle. And they said, no, this is... And I keep saying, I've read some of these mythicists, authors. They're crappy arguments, usually, in my opinion, and not even worth reading. He says, no, a lot of people said, no, a lot of people whose opinion I respected said, no, you really need to read this one and tell, because we want to know, it looks like it's legit. I mean, what do you think? Because you have a PhD in ancient history, you should know. And so I said, yeah, all right, okay, I'll do this. I'll do one. I figured I'd do one review of it, and that would be the end of it. Mm-hmm. But I found his case isn't perfect. It's not flawless, but that book makes the most persuasive case, I think, that I had ever seen. And he actually had at least enough to make it plausible to argue. Like, it wasn't ridiculous. And that made me think, because a lot of the things he pointed out is that the case for historicity is often based on fallacious arguments and speculations, just as much as mythicism is. And so after that, that's what got me into thinking it, and I sort of declared myself an agnostic at that point. I says, well, I don't think he's proven his case, but I also think he's proven that the historicity defenders have not proven their case as well, and so someone needs to do this properly. And then there came a point when I was buried in student loans, and I went to my fans on my blog and said, I'll do any project you want if you can help me, if we can get money together and pay off my student loans. And that's what they did. They said, "Oh, we want Jesus. We want you to do the definitive book on the historicity of Jesus. We want you to do that." And it's like, "Oh, okay." And it was unanimous. Like, they really wanted to. And they got together $20,000.
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah. So I treated that like a research grant. We went through a nonprofit organization so they could get charitable deductions for their donations to make this happen. And so I've taken it as a serious research project that I've basically received grant money to complete. And so I've been working on that. And the book that I just came out this year, Proving History, which is the subtitle is Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus, is the first fruit of that research project. And then the next fruit will come out next year, and that's on the historicity of Jesus Christ, which will actually lay out the case that we'll be talking about today.
And you were highly critical of Bart Ehrman's recent book this year.
I was, yes.
Did Jesus Exist? The case for...
It was a profoundly disappointing book to
me.
me.
Yes, and you said as much in your blogs and online, and there was something of a to and fro between you.
Yeah.
Now, Bart came in this studio to talk about that book earlier on in the year. We didn't have you on the line. It would have been nice to maybe got you guys together to talk about that. But I mean, one of the things he said was that he just felt that your position was largely, or the mythicist position in general, perhaps he didn't reference you at this specific point, was kind of coming from a very anti-theistic viewpoint, that there was a kind of a prior kind of bias going on here, that somehow getting rid of the historical Jesus will kind of get rid of Christianity, which will be a good thing in the long run.
I don't think anyone should actually honestly think that would happen. But anyway, I mean, there's a number of things wrong with that. I mean, first of all, I was a hardcore, outspoken atheist and critic of Christian apologetics and so forth for many years while being a historicist. So mythicism wasn't really my way of attacking Christianity. I was actually against mythicism for a very long time. It was the evidence and the argument that convinced me of that. So my motivation is not to attack Christianity with it. In fact, I think it makes attacking Christianity more difficult because in terms of the logic of cognitive science and the logic of argument and persuasion, it's easier to agree with a person on as many things as possible and then show that they're wrong.
Right. Yeah. If you're trying to dissuade someone, saying Jesus didn't exist is not going to help your case necessarily.
If you actually want to deconvert people, or at least get them out of this religion and start thinking rationally and secularly about ethics and politics, defending mythicism is not the way to go to do that. So the only reason I'm defending it is because I find it to be a persuasive case, and it's something that I think needs more attention in the scholarly community, even if ultimately it gets refuted. And then we can actually show why mythicism is false without using the sort of straw man arguments that people like Bart Ehrman have been doing.
Well, obviously, if you want to respond, Bart, you're welcome to, but this has been laid out in a number of online areas, and it wouldn't take long for you to find out more detail on that if you want to go looking for it. But let's introduce our other guest on today's programme, Mark, who joins us from Duke University, where he's Professor of New Testament. Mark, thank you for being with us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into doing New Testament studies?
Sure. Gosh. Well, I suppose I've done it. I was a student in Oxford and studying theology there, and I was always fascinated by the New Testament. I think that was the thing that really drew my interest in. And I'm just one of those few lucky people around that have managed to make it their career to do what some people, can only do for a hobby, which is read books all day and write about things and teach it. And one element in all of that is the historical Jesus. I think in some senses it's one of the toughest issues in New Testament criticism, and for that reason some people just leave it to one side. It is a minefield, and so to some extent I have sympathy with all the kind of difficulties that Richard is already having to face in his quest, because it is a dense subject, not least because there is so much written on it. No sane human being could actually manage to read all of the books that have been written on the historical Jesus in the last 50 years, let alone the last couple of hundred years, But yeah, I come to it just because it's an enthusiasm. But yes. Luckily one that I actually get paid for.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's always handy, isn't it?
It's marvellous.
I mean, as I mentioned, some people suggest that the mythicist view is propelled to some degree by a kind of anti-theistic viewpoint. Now, I know that you've written and talked about the fact that you're very keen to not allow a faith position to particularly bias your coming to historical texts as a historian, but inevitably we all come with some kind of presuppositions to the material we have, don't we? And I mean, how does that work out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that's important to do in any kind of scholarship is face up to your own prejudices, be honest about your biases, and talk about the way that you're looking at the kind of prior things that you're bringing with you. So I think that's inevitable. But at the same time, I think the more self-conscious you are about your own particular biases and your own particular background, your own particular context, the better a historian you can be. So, history is about dialogue. It's about talking to one another. It's about kind of working through some of these issues. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is getting the evidence on the table, looking at what we've actually got. So, when we're talking about these things, I don't really particularly care what people's theistic beliefs are or not. I mean, Bart Ehrman, you've mentioned a couple of times. I mean, he's a well-known, he describes himself as a happy agnostic. And, he's just down the road from me here at Duke at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he came almost reluctantly to this question just because people kept kind of bending his ear about it,
Perhaps we should start with you, though, Richard. This is a massive area, and we're trying to condense it into a half an hour, 40 minutes, say, of talking through it. But can you kind of give us the bare bones of what your thesis is about Jesus and exactly why you don't believe he actually existed.
Yeah, but let me qualify that. First of all, I don't think we can be certain one way or another. I do think that the propensity or the preponderance of evidence supports mythicism. But I think the evidence for the origins of Christianity is so scarce and so problematic that we can never have that kind of certainty that I think some people want. Both mythicists and historicists want this kind of this certainty that I don't think we can have. Nevertheless, that caveat aside, I do think there is a mythicist theory that makes better sense of the evidence we have, and is at least even if you don't think that far, even if you don't follow me to that extent, it's at least plausible, so that it's not ridiculous.
Okay,
which is
it's not so left field that it's out of the ballpark kind of thing.
But there are mythicist theories that are out of left field.
Okay,
so you could have to do a whole show on just those. And it's important to mention that because if you were to go into this now, if someone were to just start researching Jesus myth theory, especially if you were to Google it, most of the stuff you'd find is just terrible or absurd or ridiculous beyond, even in print as well, not just online. And so there are a lot of these wild conspiracy theories. Even Earl Doherty, I think, he starts with a really plausible core case, but then he just piles on a lot of speculations and additional theories about what he thinks happened, which I think go beyond the evidence.
Okay. And
so there are mythicists like that. And to me, I just want to get down to the core basic theory. And this is the way I would put it is there's only one defensible, plausible theory that Jesus didn't exist. And this is the view that Christianity began with revelations, actual or purported, of a divine being named Jesus who underwent a death and resurrection in the heavens, essentially in the lower heavens, and preached through revelations. And if you look at the letters of Paul never refers to Jesus having a ministry. He never refers to anyone seeing or meeting him while he was alive. He only talks about people receiving revelations of Jesus, and that's what made you an apostle. It's made someone an apostle was having a revelation of the Christ. So if you start with that theory, like you say, okay, let's posit that, and then presume that the Gospels and so forth are a typical kind of mythologization of a demigod, of a celestial being, called euhemerization, which happened a lot in the ancient world, where you start with a celestial worshipped god, and then he gets placed on Earth in a particular time of history, and biographies are written about him. Romulus is an example of this. Osiris is another. So these things did happen. So the question is it what happened to Jesus? And so that you have these two possible competing theories, that there was a charismatic man at the start of it, or there was this revelatory being at the start of it. And then, so is it the revelatory being who became historicized, or is it the historical being who became mythologized? This one way or another. I think any mainstream scholar agrees there's a great degree of mythology that has surrounded Jesus by the time we get to the Gospels. So that much we have agreement on. It's just a question of how much. Is it 100% mythology, or is it 90% or whatever?
Well, I mean, obviously there would be a whole nother show on for those who didn't take a historical perspective, but who did take a historicity perspective, but then disagreed on exactly how much fact we have in the Gospels as opposed to mythology.
Oh, absolutely.
But in this instance, we're just kind of trying to gear down on the very simple question of whether it was a completely mythological being to begin with, in that sense. So that's the general outline of the thesis there, Mark. I mean, any initial comments just on this?
I mean, the thing about bringing up Paul is that Paul really is some of our best evidence for the historical Jesus. I mean, he's writing within a generation of Jesus existing. I mean, he's there in the early years of the Jesus movement, and it's very clear from his epistles he's talking about a real human being. I mean, he refers to him being descended, from the seed of David, and he talks about him being born of a woman. He refers on several occasions to different things in his ministry. I mean, the thing is, Paul's taking this stuff for granted. It's very difficult to see lots of this stuff in Paul's epistles as being talking about some kind of figure that began life as a sort of cosmic mythological being. I mean, it's not just Jesus either. I mean, Paul knows loads of people from that early Christian movement, people like Peter, people like James, the brothers of Jesus, the 12. He regularly visits Jerusalem. I mean, he knows these people and talks with them. He didn't meet Jesus himself in the flesh, and that was a cause of great anxiety to Paul. I mean, if Jesus had never appeared in the flesh, then Paul wouldn't have to have any of that sort of great stress that he has, that he never actually met Jesus. I mean, his big battle in early Christianity is with people who knew Jesus in the flesh. And so Paul has to say, hey, look, I'm not in the least inferior to you lot. You super apostles, I'm still, important in my own right. So Paul is really very good evidence for the existence of a historical Jesus.
Before you come back in with that, and I'm sure you will want to, Richard. I mean, one of the examples that I think is sometimes given, certainly Bart Ehrman gave when he came on the programme, was a sort of throwaway comment in one of Paul's letters referencing James, the brother of Jesus. Which in his opinion, he said, just wouldn't make any sense if you didn't have a historical person to tie that to. It just wouldn't make sense within that context to sort of make a comment like this.
I think that's right. I mean, he refers to James several times. I mean, Galatians 1 and 2, 1 Corinthians 15. He also refers to the brothers of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 9. He refers repeatedly to this character called Cephas, or Peter, that is also known to us, from the Gospels. I mean, Paul lives and moves with these people who spent time with Jesus.
And so it seems like too absurd to suggest that somehow they're all under some kind of common colluding together to create a sort of historical person out of a mythological beginnings.
Yeah, I don't. If someone were to propose that, I think that would be a much less plausible hypothesis. But I think it's already presuming too much. You're sort of importing the gospel notions into the epistles. Because, for example, Paul never refers to Peter as a disciple. There are no disciples in Paul's letters. He never uses the word. They're all apostles. And Dr. Goodacre refers to this Paul exhibiting anxiety about not having met Jesus. That's actually not in the epistles. That's not there. For example, we have the exact opposite in the epistle to the Galatians, where Paul goes out of his way to insist that he wasn't relying on any human tradition, that he only knows what he knows through direct revelation from Jesus, and that he didn't even talk to the other apostles for many years, in fact.
Well, it's because he's been challenged by the other early Christians about his credentials. I mean, and it's clear if you look across.
But we don't know what that challenge was. That's the thing, is that you can
import. Well, we have a pretty good idea.
One assumption or the other. That's the thing, is that there could be a number of different possible causes of that same particular battle, and it seems clear that Paul is actually gaining. He's trying to argue that his authority comes from the fact that he saw Jesus in a revelation. And he doesn't actually refer to there being an actual contest. For example, it would be great if Paul said, some people have accused me of misrepresenting Jesus because Peter actually knew Jesus and he said this, that, and the other. If we had something like that in the authentic epistles of Paul, that would be pretty much very clear, undisputable evidence for the historicity of Jesus.
What we have in places like 1 Corinthians 15 is he sets out what he has received from those who were in Christ as he describes it before him. And, he kind of So he sets out this case and says that he had shared that with the Corinthians as of first importance. The reason he gets into arguments later on in places like Galatians is because you've got people like Peter and James who are making a big deal of their authority within the early Christian movement. They're the sort of so-called pillars, as it were. But it's very clear that Paul, at least in the early stage of his mission, is kind of deferring to these people and sharing traditions that they had passed on about Jesus, and they're traditions that only really make good sense of a human being on earth, someone who, died for starters. I mean.
There is this one thing that often comes up when I speak with those who perhaps question the historicity of Jesus and Paul's account, is that he mentions very few events from the life of Jesus. He doesn't mention a virgin birth and those kinds of stories from the Gospels. It's very bare. Obviously, he talks about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mm-hmm. I mean, is that any kind of give it more weight to the argument?
I think the problem with that is it's kind of reading too canonically. I mean, we read canonically because the Gospels are in the New Testament first. But actually, if you begin with Paul, it's amazing how much stuff he tells you about Jesus. I mean, he talks about his descent from David at the beginning of Romans. He talks about him being born of a woman. He talks about his teaching on specific things like divorce in 1 Corinthians 7, about his teaching on mission in 1 Corinthians 9. He mentions his family on several occasions. He talks about his other disciples. He talks about his teaching on apocalyptic in 1 Thessalonians. I mean, there's actually a surprising amount there. It's just that we're seduced into thinking there's not so much there because we are so much more familiar a lot of the time with the Gospels than we are with the epistles.
Well, it's all of those things, though, actually have explanations. They can actually be explained on the mythicist theory. For example, he doesn't talk about Jesus being executed by Pontius Pilate. He doesn't even refer to anyone, he doesn't refer to any particular historical event when he was crucified. And that's the Doherty thesis. So if you're going to compare the two theories, the theory is that this death and resurrection occurred in the lower heavens, and we have other examples of this happening. For example, there were groups of Osiris worshippers who also thought Osiris was died and resurrected in the lower heavens. So this idea that this can happen...
He refers to Judea, doesn't he? He refers to the Judeans in 1 Thessalonians 2. I mean, that's not the lower heavens. This is people that were moving around with Jesus in Judea. It's a historical place. I've been there.
Well, no, but Paul doesn't say that it happened in Judea. That's the thing. That's why the evidence we have can be explained by either theory. And so that's where we have to actually look at the two theories and see which one explains all the evidence better. And so we don't have anything that clear cut. For example, I mean, you mentioned that Paul said he received his tradition from those in Christ before him. That's not in the epistles of Paul. Paul never says that he received the tradition from those in Christ before him.
Yes, 1 Corinthians,
he only says he received
15,
it from...
3.
He very adamantly says he received it only from Jesus in a direct revelation.
No.
In fact, he uses the exact same words.
Let's just allow Mark to respond there. Sorry, go ahead.
1 Corinthians 15 clearly sets out that he says, that he'd received these traditions from those that were in Christ before him, and he passed it on to the Corinthians as a first importance.
I'm pretty sure that's not how it's worded. I can actually look that up if we want.
well, look it up. I mean, I suppose the question as well that strikes me, Richard, is, I mean, what do you think Paul was doing? Was he trying to sort of, at that point in your theory, make a historical Jesus from the heavenly Jesus, or was he only having in mind the heavenly Jesus?
I think when
you really think that everything Paul wrote about Jesus, he was just talking about a sort of spiritual Jesus, not a flesh and bone.
Spiritual is misleading, but I mean, he thought he was a real being, right? So he's having these revelations of this celestial being, and he did think he really did take on flesh, and that flesh really did die, and that he was resurrected in a new superior body. All of this happened in the exact same way that, for example, Osiris worshippers and Romulus worshippers and so on also thought these things, that these demigods would die.
Well, in a sense, that's what all Christians believe, that Jesus was a spiritual being and then incarnated as Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, and the mythicists...
But you're saying that's not what Paul was actually saying. We've somehow read our own interpretation into Paul there.
Yes and no, because the best mythicist theory, the one that's defensible in my opinion, does agree with the basic idea that Paul believed that Jesus assumed flesh, that flesh assumed the character of Davidic royalty, and that he did die, and that and that he did rise from the dead. It's just this all occurred in a spiritual realm, which is to them was a real cosmological realm. It wasn't an idea. Okay. It wasn't an abstract concept. And he knows this through revelation. And here, let's, for example, I'll quote 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, moving forward. Brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also you have received, and wherein you stand, but which also you are saved, if you keep in memory what I preached unto you, etc., etc. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received. And then he just goes on to describe the gospel, how that Christ died for our sins and so on. That's the exact same wording then you look in the book of Galatians. In Galatians 1, he says, what I passed on to you is what I received, and I only received it by revelation from Jesus.
So you're saying that then in that context, what he's received has just been a direct revelation, and he's not doing what Mark claims, which is saying he's been talking to the people around Jesus.
That's right. He denies in Galatians getting this from human tradition. Well, in fact, it looks clear that he doesn't believe human tradition is reliable, or that the Galatians would have trusted human tradition. He's saying, I got it through a revelation direct from Jesus. And let's
allow Mark to respond then. Mark, he said...
Well, I mean, Paul's letters are occasional, so you have to sort of look at each one in its own right. 1 Corinthians 15, what he's doing is he's setting out very clearly the tradition that he has received. As soon as he speaks about this receiving of tradition, he goes on to mention, first of all, Peter, and then on to James. So these are the people that we know that he went to talk to in Jerusalem from early on. When we get to Galatians, what his problem is that he's wanting to stamp his authority on the gospel that he's been preaching. So he has to say, look, I've got this gospel from God. But of course, the content of what he's picked up is from those who were in Christ, as he describes it before him. That's how he kind of sets up these things. So, I mean, quite often it's a case that we have to take seriously the way in which Paul is addressing a particular congregation, a particular community. But 1 Corinthians 15 especially is pretty rich in Jesus' tradition. And I think what happened is that a little earlier in Paul's career, he is much more inclined to use Jesus' tradition. A little later, he has to be a little bit more careful because, he's been challenged on some of these things, and Peter is becoming more of a popular person, in some of these communities, and people going, hey, what would Peter say about this? So he has to sort of, rein back a little bit and stress that he's getting things from God. But I think it's pretty clear that this is where he's
we're going to have to take a quick break. But you're adamant, Richard, that these references can all be seen through the mythicist lens as somehow simply at the end of the day talking about a Jesus in the sort of heavenly realms.
Yeah, that's the correct way to put it. That you can explain it both ways, and that's because, for example, Paul never says Peter met Jesus. For example, Peter came first. That was the problem. The 12 and the other apostles preceded Paul, and so they had the prior authority. That's the problem.
But when he talks about
Peter, the debate between them is never, well, he knew Jesus personally. That never comes up in their debate. So there's different ways to explain this, and that's the key thing. Is that Peter was first, but first what? He was the first receiver of revelation, and that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, Jesus was, according to scriptures, he died and rose again, and then he was seen by Peter and the 12, and so on. So there's no reference to them seeing him before he died, or seeing him in a ministry, or being his pals, or being picked by him, for example, while he was still alive. That's not in there. That's never mentioned in Paul. Now, it's possible Paul's deliberately avoiding
Paul's talking about resurrection in that
but
chapter.
that's an explanation.
So of course he's not going to. He hasn't got. Paul hasn't got this. He's not going to have pause to say, "Oh, and by the way, I'm just going to tell you the parable of the sower," or the point of 1 Corinthians 15 is it's occasional. He's talking about the issue of resurrection, so that's what he's focused on. But what we do as historians is we have to have a look at what people give away in passing, and what he gives away in passing there is his knowledge of an early Christian movement that was focused on someone who died, and then these characters who do appear elsewhere in Paul's epistles, who Paul has had personal conversations with in Jerusalem, So
yes, that's true. But these are the first apostles. These are the first to receive the revelations of the Jesus, according to the myth theory. That's the mythicist theory. Mm-hmm. There's no clear case where Paul gives it away as one or the other, for example. That's the key thing, is that you're importing the sort of canonical assumptions.
If I was coming to this having never read the Gospels, and my first interaction with the story of Jesus was reading Paul's letters, would I really come away thinking, oh, he's only referencing a sort of heavenly character here? It strikes me that he says enough to make you think, oh yeah, there was stuff happened that he's talking about, and it happened in real life.
But he doesn't really. It's all sort of this sort of abstract mythological concepts of dying and rising. There's no specific details, for example, like being born of a woman, but he doesn't, say born of Mary in a particular time, for example. It says, of the seed of David, but he doesn't say how he knows that.
Well, dying isn't abstract and mythological to Paul. Dying is something that he talks about all the time as happening in his own communities. And the interesting thing is, he often links death and resurrection of people in his own communities with the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't make any sense to sort of be appealing to this death of Jesus and the sufferings of Jesus that Paul feels that he shared in, if these sufferings haven't actually taken place on earth. The whole point of Paul sharing in Jesus' sufferings is that these are things that he has...
Let's give you an example. This is a more concrete piece of evidence. We have a 2nd century, probably originally 1st century document called the Ascension of Isaiah. And it's been multiply redacted by Christians. And we can tell that one piece of it that has the sort of stock gospel in it with Pontius Pilate and all that was added later, because in the Ascension of Isaiah is taken up into heaven, and this angel tells him what he's going to see in the first section, and in the next section he sees it. But it's in that section that we have this sort of gospel inserted. But when we see what the angel explains to him, he says that Jesus was a pre-existent being who's going to descend, assume a body, and that the devil, Satan, and his demons are the ones who are going to crucify and kill him in the firmament, in the lower heavens. And then he rises there, and then he's seen of the angels and Satan and his demons, and so see that he is the new resurrected Christ. So we have an example here that has to be explained either as this was the original teaching that evolved over time, or later Christians adopted the celestial Jesus view and took Jesus out of history. So it has to be one or the other. And then, of course, later Christians then doctored the second half of this by putting the historical Jesus into it. But when you look at the first section of this, it's clear.
Why, on your view, would they have done that? I mean, let's entertain the hypothesis, okay? Why would Christians, who started off believing they had a revelation of Jesus as a heavenly figure, then want to make him a historical figure?
You could ask that question of all the other gods in antiquity, because the exact same thing was done after God after God after God. You start with a celestial deity or this abstract spiritual deity that is then euhemerized. He's put on earth given a historical time. So if you want to know, like, what are the possible reasons why they would do that? We know they were doing it. One of the possible reasons is argued by Kurt Knoll in a chapter in Is This Not the Carpenter?, edited by Thomas Thompson and Thomas Verena. Kurt Knoll is a professor of religion, and he writes this chapter arguing, essentially, I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like explaining Christianity without a Jesus, basically without a historical Jesus. And he says there's a polemical and sort of basic natural selection advantage to a church that packages its deity as a historical deity and creates a physical tradition that it can trace back. So creating this idea that Peter knew Jesus personally and then passed it on as a human tradition is rhetorically useful.
Let's allow Mark to come in here. Go ahead, Mark.
I think one of the problems with this view is that actually early Christians, and this isn't just Paul, actually had a lot of trouble explaining to people about the crucifixion. I mean, Paul says at one point that the idea of a crucified Messiah is something that is a stumbling block to his fellow Jews, a scandalon to his fellow Jews. And the thing is, it's not something that they're kind of manufacturing. This is something that they spend lots of the time attempting to explain. It's kind of embarrassing to them at first. And in fact, Paul himself, who persecuted that early Christian movement, presumably persecuted it largely because they were coming out with this preposterous idea that the Messiah was going to be crucified. So what they do is that they're working with a tradition, with something that they're repeating that is actually to lots and lots of people something that they find kind of horrifying. And the thing that's horrifying about it is the idea that the Messiah in history, on earth, in the recent past, was crucified, which was something they knew about. They knew about crucifixion and were horrified by it. And the idea that the Messiah would go through that was particularly horrifying.
It's a kind of what you might call the criterion of embarrassment, which is often used in historical Jesus studies for suggesting that it doesn't make sense for them to, if they're manufacturing a story, put details in which should just make their story all the harder to believe. And that goes back to things like women discovering the empty tomb and things like that. But I'd also be interested in hearing your perspective, Mark, on whether, in your view, in that context of Judaism at that time, in that place, that this would have been a likely thing to happen. It may have happened in pagan cultures, what Richard's describing of a mythological god being given a historical nature. Would that have been likely to happen in Judaism at that time?
I think that's a good question, and I think this is one of the things that make the Gospels themselves quite interesting to read. We've talked a lot about Paul, we haven't talked so much about the Gospels, but if you take Mark's Gospel, for example, Mark spends much of his time trying to explain that, in spite of all appearances to the contrary, this idea of a crucified Messiah isn't that balmy. And that's really lots of what it... And the thing is, he even depicts the disciples, people like Peter that we know, from later Christianity as well. He depicts them as going, surely this can't be right. Surely, you can't get crucified. Surely you can't suffer, and so on. And so I think, you do have this feeling that it is a bit against the grain. It is kind of troubling. And the early Christian gospel was always that struggle with this great paradox that they were claiming that Jesus was God's special anointed one, but that his destiny wasn't what lots of people thought it should be. I mean, for a start, he doesn't ever become king and start reigning. His things are kind of cut off before he even gets to the point of establishing his new reign.
And so it's that kind of old thing, Richard, of if you're going to make up a story, don't make up this one, because it's going to be really hard to sell to people at the end of the day in that time and culture. So wouldn't it have made more sense if they were going to do what you're suggesting they did, that they wouldn't have had him being crucified and
not necessarily
rising again and all that sort of thing? Because
creating absurd, embarrassing, paradoxical religion was very common at the time. To take an exact analogy, we have the god Attis, right? The god Attis died through castration. And in honor of this, his priests castrated themselves. And castration was one of the most humiliating things. It was a very despicable kind of idea, from especially among the Roman and Greek elite, the idea that you would emasculate yourself. And yet they went around preaching this religion, that they're worshiping an emasculated God who castrated himself, and that priests, if you want to become a priest, you have to castrate yourself. So this is not an argument for there actually having been an Attis who actually castrated himself. It's an example of how religions often preach these things that are paradoxical because they have a sort of emotive value. Like, once you can get someone to believe this, you can sort of get them into a whole system of theology that's based on the suffering of the God. And there's a lot of different examples of these different demigods who underwent some sort of great ordeal or suffering. Many of them do die and rise from the dead, but many of them just undergo great struggles, and it's always called suffering. It's a passion. The exact same word is used. And through this suffering, they acquire power over death, and by sharing in that, the believer can also acquire power over death and become saved, essentially. Christianity is exactly copying a model of this kind of religion, where this personal salvation cult that existed in many different forms before this occurred. But this idea of the argument from embarrassment is multiply problematic for this reason and many other reasons. And in Proving History, which is the one book you can get now, I have an extensive section on that. So if you actually want to see how the mythicists would respond to the entire gamut of argument from embarrassment arguments, including the crucifixion argument, that's the place to look, and you could do a whole show just on that.
Well, we have talked about it before in other contexts and other shows. But Mark, I guess the question I'm left with is, does it seem plausible in what you know about literature at that time and in that place, and the type of literature that comprises those early Gospels of Mark and so on, that this could be seen as a historicisation of a spiritual thing that someone had come up with some time before? I mean, is it a plausible? Does it strike you as plausible, quite apart from these issues around Paul's references?
Yeah, it doesn't make. I find it extraordinarily difficult to grasp historically. I think it's a very difficult case to make. I mean, not least because we know quite a lot about Judaism from this period. It's not like Christianity just suddenly emerges in some great vacuum. So we know what kind of people like Paul and Peter and James, we know what kind of people they were. We know how lots of Jews in this period thought. That's why when we get this stuff that they're telling us about Jesus, we can actually get a good idea that they're not just kind of randomly making this stuff up, because we have an idea how Jews in this period thought. We know how lots of Jews reacted to the way that the early Christian movement talked as well. I mean, just to sort of tag something about the criterion of embarrassment, I share some of Richard's caution about this criterion. I don't think that ultimately the early Christians were embarrassed by what they were preaching. I mean, they basically were claiming that Christ died for our sins and so on. They weren't embarrassed by that, and lots of the things that scholars claim they're embarrassed by, clearly they weren't, because they were all saying it. And if I'm embarrassed about something, I tend not to confess it, to sort of openly. So I think it's not that. What it rather is they're conscious of the fact that other people know that it sounds odd. So when people like Paul talk about Christ crucified, and when Mark in his gospel constructs the gospel around the idea of a Christ crucified, they know it sounds weird. They know it sounds strange to other people. And the reason they know that is because that they're Jews engaging in this discussion together with its own sort of shared presuppositions and shared background and so on. And that's why I think the idea of a sort of mythicist Jesus is so difficult to get one's head round, because we actually have some idea how Jews in this period thought about these things.
Well, I think that's actually somewhat misleading, because in fact there were dozens of different Jewish sects that were very diverse, and we know almost nothing about most of them. So I think it's an argument from ignorance to say that because we know certain Jews, especially primarily the rabbinical Jews, what they thought, or the Qumran Jews, what they thought, that therefore we know what all Jews thought. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. We don't really, because there's a lot of diversity there, and more diversity than we are aware of, in fact. So we can't really launch from arguments like we know what all Jews would think at the time.
No, we don't know what all of them thought, but we have a good idea what lots of them thought. And and to understand the early Christian movement, we have to understand it as one of those sects within Judaism. And one of the elements that that Christians like Paul shared with other people, like say Pharisees and like the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, is they believed in resurrection of the body. And the whole point of that there is that the human being actually dies on earth first. So what it means is we can get our heads around certain things that lots of Jews in this period thought. And once we get our heads around that, it's much easier to understand how it is that Jesus fits into that picture.
Well, just to give you an example of how diverse Jewish views could be, for example, we have the life of Adam, where Adam is actually buried in heaven, for example. So there's this unusual concept that you can actually have dirt and earth and buried in heaven. I mean, these kinds of, there's a lot of different views that you can find. And this idea also of the ultimate sacrifice, if you read Hebrews 9, and just if that's all you knew, for example, about Christianity, the theology of Hebrews 9 makes perfect sense within Judaism. It's this idea, it's essentially of completing the Isaac sacrifice. Now, if you imagine there was a Jewish sect, let's pretend for a moment that there was a Jewish sect in which Isaac was actually sacrificed, that Abraham went through with the sacrifice, and that sacrifice gave people salvation, and therefore people went around worshiping the heavenly Isaac, right, who was sacrificed by this. That would make sense within Judaism. And Christianity is essentially just that. This Jesus is supposedly the sort of ultimate Isaac, because in the Abraham and Isaac story, an animal is substituted for Isaac, and in Jewish tradition, this was the original Yom Kippur, and in a sense, the original atonement sacrifice that it washed people of their sins. But it had to be repeated every year, because an animal sacrifice doesn't have the mojo of a human sacrifice. But if you want the most powerful magical sacrifice that you can get, what do? You sacrifice God's one and only Son. It makes sense theologically within a certain mindset. I mean, you can imagine a sect of Jews.
I could imagine also that Hebrews, of all the letters, perhaps supports your case. We get a lot of language there of Jesus entering into the heavenlies and all the rest of it. But obviously that. We're not in any sense obliged to see that as Paul writing that letter. It's
true.
But even there with Hebrews, I mean, the argument works on the basis that Jesus has been tempted and the believer has gone through trials, but none of them as great as the trials through which Jesus has gone. So the writer of Hebrews compares the way that the contemporary Christian lives with the way that Jesus lived as a human being on earth that went through these sorts of things, real bodily suffering on earth. So even the Epistle to the Hebrews requires that.
If Hebrews had said that, there would be no debate. But if we read, like in Philippians, for example, where Jesus is a pre-existent being who takes on basically a humble form on purpose and undergoes great suffering and therefore is exalted, it makes the specific point that he was given the opportunity to take on equality with God and rejected it. So it even refers to the temptation of the celestial being in the celestial state before he became incarnated.
But you see, the problem is,
so
I read that famous passage from Philippians and immediately attribute it to the incarnation of Jesus as a physical human being. Now, why?
In mythicist theory, that is what's going on. It's just not going on Earth. See, that's the thing.
It's
in their cosmological system. It's happening in a different place.
He takes the form of a slave in the Philippians. He takes the form of a slave, and that's the whole point about crucifixion, that it's a slave's punishment. So once again, we come back to the historical event of the crucifixion that's taking place on earth in the same way that a slave has been crucified. That's what it's saying. It's the lowest of the low. It's not even the lowest heaven. It's right down here in the lowest low on earth.
Well, it doesn't say that, though. It doesn't say that, though. I mean, that's the thing, is that's one way to interpret it, but it's so vague that it can actually be interpreted the other way as well. It could fit the original redaction of the Ascension of Isaiah, or it could fit the Gospel of John. It can fit either one. And that's the problem. That's why I think certainty can't be had here, because we don't have a smoking gun either way. And so what we want to look at is, what is the overall best explanation of all of the evidence? And there are certain things that I haven't brought up that haven't come up. And
I'm sure you wouldn't have time, no. But
yeah. Well, I should mention one, because it's not something that you would be likely to ask about or to mention. The fact that we do have a reference to, in Jewish theology, a pre-existent being named Jesus, who was the firstborn Son of God, who was the high priest of the celestial temple, just like Hebrews explains, and was also called the Logos, the Word of God. And this is in Philo, who's a contemporary, writing at the same time as Paul. Philo refers to this deity several times. This deity is perhaps the wrong word, but he's an archangel in Philo's vocabulary, who's named Jesus. So there's already this pre-existent firstborn Son of God named Jesus, who's the high priest, just like Hebrews says, and so on. Already pre-exists Christianity. So there's already this celestial deity going around. So when you, Deity again, archangel,
Yeah.
It's pagan versus Jewish vocabulary for divine beings. But so you already have this. So when you look at Philippians and you look in that in the context of this pre-Christian Jewish theology of the other Jesus, you can see it in the same sense as the Ascension of Isaiah. The original redaction of the Ascension of Isaiah portrays it. So it does make sense within that context. And I think this is one of the things that it is an obligation upon me to prove and extensively document, and that's what my next book is going to do. And I do think it needs to be done. I don't think it's something that I should just assume everybody understands right out of the gate, and I don't expect people to buy into it until they've seen the documentation and all of the
Sure.
the
I don't know if you're familiar with any of the documentation referred to there, Mark.
Oh, yes, of course. But I mean, one has to be ever so careful not to make these sort of big sort of leap. I mean, Richard is a really intelligent guy and he's well read, but the thing is, he has a tendency to make these kind of big leaps all the time into material, so that where an analogy is only ever used, it seems to me, in order to try and disprove the historicity of Jesus. And I'm not sure really it's the way that one approaches history. What one has to do is one has to kind of try and get inside the way that Paul, for example, is talking about things, get inside the way the gospel writers are talking about these things, and ask, does this make best sense as people who are talking about a human being who is living within recent history? And each occasion, it makes so much better sense to regard them as talking about a real historical being that was living in recent history, and where lots of the time, in the case of some of the earlier writings, they actually knew people who knew him. They knew his family. They had met these people and ate with them and argued with them. And I think, when Paul had gone down to Jerusalem and chatted with James and Peter, James would have been absolutely horrified, by the idea that the brother that he'd grown up with and eaten fish with didn't actually exist. I think, he would probably be more shocked.
I mean, I'd be interested in hearing from you as well, Mark, of the nature of the literature, say, for instance, the Gospel of Mark. As I understand it, and I have nowhere like the background of either of you guys, but that it's generally seen as falling within a genre of sort of historical biography. Now, and does it strike you as plausible at all that this would not be telling a reason, the deeds of Jesus, but rather that it is a retelling of something that happened in a heavenly realm on an earthly plane? Is there another genre of literature that should fall into if it were that, and does it look like that at all from your knowledge of the period?
I mean, it is definitely worth contrasting the canonical Gospels plus one or two other non-canonical texts with some of the kind of revelation type discourses that you do get in later Christianity, which are much better suited to talking purely about a celestial being. I mean, the Gospels do have very important analogies with the lives, the bioi as they're called, that you find in Greco-Roman literature. But I mean, at the same time, they are Gospels. They're kind of propaganda for a particular cause, and of course they're trying to sell Jesus to people. But the point about the Jesus they're trying to sell is that he's a real flesh and blood character, and that is absolutely clear from the message that they're preaching all the way through. They are thoroughly persuaded that the Jesus that they're talking about is a figure in history, and
or they want the readers to be persuaded of this.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, to give an analogy that's kind of outside that actually I think would create more agreement is we look at John, for example, versus Mark and their accounts of the resurrection. And you can trace the development throughout the other Gospels, but you compare the two. John is clearly creating all the evidence he can think of to sort of make it look like Jesus actually rose in the flesh and so on, because he shows his wounds and the discovery of the empty tomb and the discovery of the burial cloths, and he's embellishing the story specifically to sell a particular view of what happened at the resurrection, which I think I would suspect Dr. Goodacre would probably agree is fiction, that he's making that up, that there wasn't really those events particular that John is creating and crafting aren't real, that he's creating those events in order to sell a particular view of Jesus. If you can do that for the resurrection, you can do that for Jesus in general. And I think that's what a lot of the Gospels are doing, especially Luke and John. Mark and Matthew, there can be some debate there, because if you take Mark, for example, when he gives the first parable in Mark, and it's in Mark 4, he immediately has Jesus explain, to you in secret, to talking to his disciples, the mystery of kingdom of God is explained, and I'll explain what the parables mean. But to the public, I say everything in parables to conceal the truth from them. And that, in a sense, is kind of a clue to what the whole thing of Mark is. And this is what John Dominic Crossan's latest book, The Power of Parable, argues, is that the Gospels are extended parables, that they're parables about Jesus, not just parables from Jesus. And I think that, if you see it in that sense, you can see Jesus is being used to sell a particular doctrine. And then once you start doing that, it becomes more and more useful to actually insist that that was a real historical Jesus.
I mean, we can have a debate, Mark, I suppose, about the extent to which John embellishes and there's additions and whatnot. But I suppose the question for me is, are those what we call synoptic accounts fiction from the start? You know, something that where they've literally thought this stuff up about this character Jesus to put him in this kind of earthly historical plane as opposed to this heavenly realm. I have to confess, I'm having trouble buying that, but
that'll be my next book. No, I mean, in all honesty, in all sincerity, that I do think that this is something that requires a lot of preparation and background and explanation, and a rigorous presentation of the logic, why the conclusion follows. Like Dr. Goodacre referred to this, leaps of logic and leaps of assumption. I agree those are bad. So we want to come up with a way so that if I do that in the formal presentation that will come out next year, that it'll be identifiable, and therefore we can say that's the problem with the theory. And so I actually want to see that happen if it can be done. So that'll be the goal of the next book, is to model and present the argument in all its glory, and then in such a way that if there's flaws in it, they can be easily identified, and then we can finally move on.
Well, I'll let you respond, because I know you want to, Mark, in the next section. Does it just seem utterly implausible to you that this was kind of made up from the start, those synoptic gospels, the accounts of the life of Jesus, or is there something in what Richard says there about some kind of an extended parable is what we're actually witnessing in the gospels?
Well, the thing is, in any writing, and this isn't just ancient writing, of course you have layers and layers of interpretation, and there is no such thing as an unvarnished truth. There's no such thing as an uninterpreted memory. So lots of the time what you've got all of these details, these traditions are refracted through particular people's memories. But the job of the historian is to take all of those traditions as seriously as he or she can, and to kind of penetrate into them and sort of work out what it is that we can say with confidence. And I think we just create so many problems for ourselves if we kind of take the historical Jesus out of the picture altogether. I think we do have to make, and I know that Richard balks when I talk about this kind of thing, but I think we do have to make so many strange leaps if we assume that there is no Jesus in the picture. Probably more than anything else, you can see not just that we've got Jesus in this picture, we've got lots and lots of other characters that are in the story too, and which only hyper-skepticism would cause us to doubt the historicity of. I mean, part of the problem as well, if I can just comment very briefly on the whole nature of doing ancient history, one of our problems is that people only survive insofar as they are remembered by people they made an impact on. So, of course, you're not going to find, coins with historical Jesus on in the same way that we do with Pontius Pilate, or kind of any sort of steps with his name, graffitied on by anybody. But the evidence we would expect to find is exactly what we do find, which is Jesus surviving in the memories of those who are closest to him. And of course, those memories are profoundly influenced by all sorts of other things and their own kind of creative things, and there'll be legendary things that kind of come as well. But at the same time, that is exactly the kind of historical evidence we would expect to find it in the memories which become the traditions in that early kind of community. That's what we'd expect to find, and it's what we do find.
Yes, and so you're addressing there the aspect of mythicism, which I don't know whether Richard particularly supports, which is that, we need documents and coins like we do for other historical figures of history like Caesar. That's simply not what you're asking for realistically with a character like Jesus. But what we do have is, as you say, what you would expect for a figure of his import and where he lived and all the rest of it at that time. And for you, that's
and
just...
goes quite early. I mean, this stuff goes pretty early. I mean, we've talked, ad nauseum about Paul, but I mean, Paul is pretty early. He's in 40s and 50s when he's writing. He's actually mixing with these characters in the 30s, not long after Jesus' death. So, we're pretty close in time to these characters. Even the writing of the Gospels, we're only talking within a couple of generations or so, the events that they're describing. So they're pretty close to events.
Yes, in terms of the kind of timescales you're normally talking about with these types of historical figures. Well, for you then, obviously, Mark, you finish up by saying simply the most common sense for you, as far as you can see, is to simply assume that we do have a historical character. You take him out, and there's just too many problems that then are created by doing that.
I think that's right. I think it becomes tortuous after a while if one pursues the mythicist argument to its logical conclusions. I think there are so many difficult moments in the argument, it just becomes terribly strained. And at the end of the day, sometimes when we're doing history, we have to go for the simplest hypothesis. And the simplest one in this case, the one that explains all the evidence best, is the one that there was a historical figure called Jesus.
Well, I hope you'll pick up a copy of Richard's book and the coming one coming out soon as well, and perhaps you can have another engagement once you've seen the full argument. But
I would very much like that. I mean, I respect Dr. Goodaker's opinion and his ability to analyze evidence. So I think what his response is to my next book. Although I would love to see him do a review of my current book as well. Although this book, that book doesn't actually argue the thesis we've been talking about today.
It kind of sets it up.
It does set it up, but
I actually agree. I actually agree with some things in Richard's current book, actually, and some of his material about method is exactly right. And just to finish myself on a cordial note, I think one of the things that we have to do as historians is we have to be a bit skeptical sometimes, and a skeptical nature is often a very healthy thing. So I like that kind of side of things, but I think that we have to be careful not for that healthy skepticism not to turn into a kind of hyper skepticism.
Sure. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, that is often the way people talk about you as among the hyper skeptics
on this one issue. You think?
On this issue. I mean, for you've obviously come to the considered opinion that this is the best explanation overall, taking every factor into account.
But it isn't. It's interesting because Dr. Goodaker did refer to the one correct point, and as you mentioned as well, that the mere absence of evidence is not sufficient to argue for the non-existence of Jesus, and that is hyper-skepticism. If you say, well, we don't have coins, I did a talk for Skepticon just this last weekend, where I use an example of the Glycon cult, where we actually have coins stamped of the god with the god's image on it, who was incarnated on Earth within his supposed lifetime.
Yeah.
So we have things like that, but we don't have any particular reason to expect that to have occurred for Jesus. So the idea that the absence of evidence in that respect suggests Jesus didn't exist is not a valid argument, because we can explain that evidence just as easily on historicity, as long as we accept that the Gospels hugely exaggerate his fame. So as long as we're willing to accept that he was a more obscure, lesser-known person, which is easy to accept as a plausible historical theory of how Christianity began, that he was not famed across all Syria, that kind of the thing that the Gospels say about it. So yeah, there are ways to build plausible historicity theories, but so the question is, you have to look at all of the evidence. But I think the problem is that there's problems with that evidence, with the evidence on that theory as well. There's problems either way. So it's not a question that mythicism creates problems. I think mythicism is an attempt to solve certain problems that are already created by the historicity theory and its difficulty in explaining a lot of the evidence. However, that's a case that I have to make, and so we'll see how that proceeds in the coming years.
Well, thank you for coming in and talking to us about it today, Richard. And Mark, thank you very much for being available from Duke University. And if people want to find out more about you and your work, do you want to just give the website that they should go to?
Oh, sure. You could go to probably the thing people would most enjoy would be my podcast, which is called the NT Pod. Just Google for NT Pod, or go to podacre.blogspot.com, or just go to iTunes.
Yeah, absolutely. So check that out, and Mark podcasts on all kinds of issues in New Testament history there. And equally, if people want to find out more about your own writings and research, you've got a website as well, haven't you, Richard?
Yes, www.richardcarrier.info.
Okay, well, there's the place to go, and I'm, of course, going to post those links with the podcast of this programme at premier.org.uk/unbelievable.